Hi, John.
Hi, Sam. How are you?
Oh, goodness. I'm hanging in. I'm on day 16 of self-quarantine. How are
Okay.
you?
We're good. We're good. We're still on a shelter-in-place order here in Dallas, but yeah, we are finding ways to make use of the time, and so it's nice.
Yeah, making use of time has taken on a new register of meaning in this moment,
Yeah.
I think. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me about thinking in dark times this afternoon. Um, so I'm asking everyone the same question to begin, which is a question that Hannah Arendt posits in The Life of the Mind, which feels like it has also taken on new meaning in this moment, which is, where are you when you think? So where
Yeah.
are you? And how is this moment affecting your ability to think?
Yeah. Just where I'm localized right now is in our home, and certainly learning to share that in a different way with my wife and our son.
Mm.
Uh, Space becomes um, really territorial as people try to find places. My son tried to find a place to play, and my wife tried to find a place to read, and me try to find a place to read, and it's tough sometimes. But what's interesting about that question in The Life of the Mind, I think, with Arendt, is that she actually later says, it's the wrong question, precisely because it tries to orient us in a spatial direction when in fact thinking is a temporal activity. And there, I think that it's worth thinking about because she's going back to Kant there,
Yes.
who is emphasizing the role of imagination in thinking, right?
Yes.
Not as much as he should, but I think just returning to a little short essay by Walter Benjamin on imagination.
Hmm.
He says that the artist is engaged in this activity of deforming the world in his mind. So I always think of this as the way the Painter in Modern Life by Baudelaire, how the artist goes into the street and he's soaking up all of Paris and the colors and the textures and even the hems of garments, and then coming back and spilling it out onto the page in a poem or into a painting. And the artist is living in such a way that they're capturing things from the world and then disassembling it and then reforming it in some way. And I kind of think that if Arendt has that sort of in the background of her mind, those that Benjaminian notion of imagination and also the Kantian notion, then I think she sees thinking as a withdrawal from the world, as a time to begin to disassemble things,
Hmm.
um, and to begin reassembling. So what I've been thinking about recently is, given that all of the things that we relied upon, my office on campus with all of my books is now
Oh,
secured, and luckily I brought home a trove, but there's only so much you can carry, right? And so the office is locked, but you can get there if you have a police escort, but then you have to ask the policeman to expose himself to possible infection. And um, the grocery store, I want someone to stock those things for me, but they have to show up to work and put themselves at risk. And
hmm.
I think what I've been thinking about is the way that this kind of interdependence that has been largely hidden from us as we go through our lives, we now have the space to think about it.
Hmm.
And all of these hidden relationships that we have with the soccer at Kroger, whom we don't know, but has now become essential to our lives, is really important. And uh, so perhaps this is a time to reflect upon the ways that we're deeply connected with one
Hmm.
another. And maybe that gives us a space to think about what our responsibilities are to other people.
Yeah. The first the first part of your answer, thinking about Arendt's reading of Benjamin and Arendt's reading of Kant and the Kantian notion of what it means to go wandering in our imagination, which is a kind of empathetic exercise, I think is very much related to that understanding of what it means to have an ethical responsibility to one another. Arendt tied the two together when she was writing about Adolf Eichmann, of course, and thinking about what it was precisely that he lacked that enabled him to engage in the horrific activities that he engaged in. She says it was precisely this inability to imagine the world from the perspective of another that is what made it like talking to a brick wall. So you have written this book, which I have here. I have the proof copy, so you don't get to see the nice image on the front, on Hannah Arendt and the fragility of human dignity. Can you talk a little bit about Hannah Arendt's conception of dignity and what it means to have dignity in dark times?
So the second part is interesting. Yeah. Let's talk about the first part. What Arendt thinks about dignity. Maybe I should say what she thinks it's not first.
Okay.
She's explicit that it is not a feature of a human nature. In other words, she's rejecting the traditional views of human dignity, which, by the way, emerged very late in our ethical and political tradition. You can see beginnings of discussions around human dignity in the Renaissance thinkers, which Arendt was reading deeply for a long time. And then you obviously see it in the post-war period in the declarations and the basic law of Germany and the like. You start seeing human dignity. But Arendt was bothered by this idea that somehow it was some kind of natural feature of us, that because we have reason, we have human dignity, or because we have a soul, we have human dignity. Because if it was the case that this was the basis for human rights, then all that needed to be asserted was simply the givenness of our natures, right? But this is precisely what wasn't there when human rights failed in the Second World War. And I think another thing, and this is in the title of my book, is that she thinks human dignity is fragile. She thinks it is something that we can forfeit through our actions, as Eichmann did. She thinks it's something that can be destroyed, which she said the camps were explicitly designed for. And so when I first started reading her about human dignity, I was seeing it all the time, but she never gives a definition of it. And she doesn't refer to anyone who's talking about human dignity. And she doesn't go back to Kant. I thought, well, surely she's going to go back to Kant and say that it's this regulative idea of freedom that gives us our dignity.
That's related to reason somehow.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and you know this from teaching that labor work action essay, which I now teach every semester, which is wonderful. But in that essay, she rejects Kant's idea that human beings are ends in themselves. She says, if every human being is an end in themselves, and everything else is simply a means. In other words, if we make human beings an end, we turn animals and nature and the entire world simply into a resource for our own exploitation. And so she finds that problematic too. So I was in search of some kind of conception, and I will say she doesn't have an explicit account or theory. And I think if she was asked to give one, she would be reticent to give one, right? As she was with most things, even with the question of thinking, right? She says, I'm only raising these questions about where we are when we think, just to get us thinking about thinking, not to give us an answer, right? And so I conceived her as rethinking the tradition of human dignity, that it was unsatisfying. She explicitly says any notion of some inborn dignity that we come into the world with is a myth and should be discarded. She said it was even pernicious. as a myth, because it doesn't lead us to take responsibility for others in the way that she thinks that we should. So I argue that she thinks dignity is an intersubjective event of political experience. So it's strictly a political concept. And
can you say what that means for people who might not be as familiar with Arendt's conception of dismantling metaphysics and returning us to the kind of earthly realm of human affairs?
Right. So I read Arendt as a philosopher of eminence, and I mean that in the sense that she is not linking her political ideas on any notions of a transcendent human nature or soul or God or history.
Yeah.
She's also not a transcendentalist.
No.
She wants us to locate ourselves in that wreckage of history after the Shoah, and to turn us back to each other in the midst of a crisis. And perhaps now this is more relevant than ever. She wants us to find ourselves in the midst of the wreckage and to try to begin to rethink what we mean by things like freedom and authority and power and violence. And I argue human dignity, that she thinks that as in the midst of that post-war period, when people are beginning to formalize what that means and connect it with human rights, she sees some problems. She sees us moving back into some metaphysical fallacies that are no longer tenable.
Yeah.
And so I think what she was trying to do was give us an imminent account of human dignity. And that means we have to go back to the political experience where it originates. And where it originates is in the way we stand towards each other. And here I'm also very close to Stephen Darwall's notion of human dignity, which he calls the second person perspective, right? That human dignity and what my obligations are to another human being arise in this intersubjective experience with other human beings. And that's precisely where Arendt wants us to begin. And I think those later Kant lectures really get into this when she says, we have to return to this practice of letting the mind go visit. What is it like to be this other human being? And she fails in this way several times, in the Little Rock essays. Not a good example of letting the mind go visiting, right? And there are other examples. But
where the on violence essay springs to mind.
Yes, exactly, which y'all are about to explore.
Yes, in the virtual reading group, yes. Yeah. So it reminds me, you brought up Benjamin and the flaneur adjacently earlier, and it really reminds me of that Baudelaire poem, The Crowds, and the spirit of the poet who goes wandering in and out of the crowd, looking through the eyes of others. And then he has this wonderful line in there about how, needing to populate one's own solitude, and the man who can't do that will be lonely in the crowd. But it's not empathy, which I think is why the Baudelaire is so helpful there. It's not Rousseau's conception of pity or empathy. It's closer to that Kantian understanding of imagination. And I think for Arendt, when she's thinking about that, the appearing before one another, the interdependence that is necessary for individual recognition, which for her is necessarily plural. We need the public realm as much as we need the private realm in order to be fully human, which involves being able to speak and to act and to be recognized in our speech and our action. And for her, though, that expansiveness, that appearance, the imagining is not what we might colloquially understand to be a form of empathy. It's not about feeling. It's not about experiencing the affective experience of another, or as I like to say to my students, the kind of Bill Clinton, I feel your pain. That's not what we're talking about. So how do we conceptualize an idea of dignity when we're confronted with so much suffering that allows us to engage in this exercise of expanding the imagination and critical thinking and judgment, without succumbing to like the immediacy of our affective responses.
Yeah, I think maybe the way she would have us consider that letting the mind go visiting is that it should evoke in us a responsibility, a sense of responsibility, not of empathy, right? So, for example, when she's talking about guilt after World War II, in that essay, Political Responsibility Under Dictatorship, I think, where she's responding, I think, to Joel Feinberg's essay. No, it's Collective Responsibility, sorry. She says,
well, there's two essays. So there's
two essays.
Those are two different essays. Yeah.
Yeah, they are. She's responding to Joel Feinberg in Collective Responsibility, and there she wants to say any of this notion of collective guilt, that we're all guilty for what happened in World War II, is a mind game. But she says, I can be collectively responsible. And when I usually discuss this, I talk about this in terms of American slavery. Certainly, it's a mind game to say that I'm guilty of slavery. I didn't participate in slavery. I obviously never owned slaves, but that doesn't mean that I'm not responsible. And Arendt wants us to think about that. The idea of guilt is that idea of trying to feel this pity and suffering and feeling. But the idea of responsibility is kind of a disinterested recognition of what my role is in the world. And it doesn't require me to lacerate myself with feelings of guilt and pity for other human beings when I see their suffering. On the contrary, it prepares me for action by having that kind of disinterested responsibility and realizing that my role in the world is to accept the burden of my responsibility for other human beings, right? And even in this time of the coronavirus, I have a responsibility not to expose my neighbors to an unseen virus that I might be carrying unknowingly, right? So withdrawing myself from space, we're making myself available to my family. Those kinds of things are responsibilities that I have.
Yeah. In that essay on personal responsibility under dictatorship, when she's talking about how we make individual decisions in situations that are morally compromising for our inner harmony, that oftentimes when she's talking about Nazi Germany, and she's talking about what happens when those moral codes and banisters we hold on to in everyday life dictate murder, right? When that is what is legally permissible, then we need to find another way to think about what is right and wrong in order to hold ourselves accountable to ourselves. So we need new moral categories. We need new concepts and categories to hold on to in thinking. Then she's also talking about this idea that she says, I think in there, if everyone is guilty, then no one is guilty.
Right.
And I'm wondering, as you were talking just now, I'm wondering, to what extent Arendt, as a thinker of moral, moral philosophy questions in certain ways, is a thinker to think with right now, because we have doctors on the nightly news telling us to act as if we're all guilty. We're all right. They're flipping it. That we all, the responsible thing to do right now is to assume that we're all carrying the coronavirus, and to to withdraw from the public realm, to not act, to not appear. And I don't think we can map the two on to one another in a clean way in thinking about ethical responsibility. But I'm wondering how Arendt's conception of ethical responsibility to care for one another in this way might be helpful in thinking about how to act in this moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the differences between, say, realizing that we all may be potential carriers of a virus versus that we're all guilty of some action is that
Right.
her point about action is that they're always done by individuals.
Yeah.
So this collective guilt notion robs the individual of his own responsibility. There's something very Hegelian there too, right? Part of what Hegel says about punishment is that punishment is visited on the offender precisely to affirm him in his freedom, right? You were free to do this, and we're affirming this is your choice. You chose to use your freedom this way. So, but one thing about action and speech, which just going back to the notion of dignity, on my account, dignity arises from this complex of natal capabilities that express themselves in speech and action. But we don't come into the world able to speak and act. It's interesting. We learn to speak, and Judith Butler is really good on this. We learn to speak when someone addresses us. And we hear that language and we learn how it sounds and we practice it in our responses. But we speak precisely because somebody recognized us and spoke to us. And we learned how to speak back to them. And it's the same way with action. When my son was born, he could not feed himself, right? His arms just flailed about his body and he wasn't able really to do anything. But to the degree that we train him, we work with him, we model for him how to move bodies in space, and he gets command of his own body, he takes ownership of it and he begins to act. But that happens with other people. And
Right.
so it's interesting that when Arendt says that our speech and action is this expression of our individuality, right, showing who we are in the world, that performance is predicated upon our engagement already with other people. In some ways, the capacities are a gift from other people. And so our responsibility emerges precisely on that exchange, I think, that intersubjective exchange.
Yeah, the way that you phrase it strikes me as very Hegelian, and I'm reminded of the first sentence of the master-slave dialectic when he says self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself, but only in relationship to another. So
Yeah.
we exist independent of one another, but always and only in relationship to one another as well. But action is something that for Arendt that we is something that happens in concert with others. She says in the human condition that the fundamental character of action is plurality. Plurality is what conditions all human action, and this co-appearance with one another, men and not man, inhabit the earth and make the world in common. But it's also something that we attach a name to, she says. An action without an individual name attached to it is not an action at all. So we also have that, I think, in her conception of action, as you were saying, the idea of the individual, but the individual who's always acting in concert with others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That reminds me of in the Life of the Mind. I've been going back and I picked up Adolph Portman's books that she has, and I have some of those, yeah, really cool books. But when she talks about, I've always wanted to do an essay on the number of urges that she talks about in the Life of the Mind. There's like an urge to speak, an urge to appear, an urge to think. It's like,
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're a complex of urges for her in that last work. But that urge to appear, she says, is always an appearance for someone else. And so our speech and action as being that kind of appearance is always a performance in front of others. And so even when we think we're just speaking on our own and acting on our own, we're actually doing it for someone. We want to be seen. And I think that's where we can see our connectedness with others is already present in the way we try to show ourselves in the world. And this is precisely, I think, where our responsibility comes in. If it is the case that I know that my dignity is what I show in my speech and action, right? As I perform and innovate out of these native capabilities that I have, then And I'm doing that for the sake of another who is
Right.
going to observe that. I know they're also going, I'm seeking their response, whether I'm asking them to move out of the way or obey my commands or to respond to me about what I'm thinking. I'm asking them to enact their natal capabilities in response to mine. And therefore, I'm already recognizing
Mhm.
their dignity. But I can assert my dignity, but it doesn't have to be recognized, right? I mean, we have cases, the Rohingya in Myanmar. Um, um, we have cases where people are not recognized, where they're not heard, where they're not seen, where they're prevented from speaking and performing.
Yeah.
Um, but we also have cases where people are recognized and they're no longer capable of asserting their dignity. For example, the Muslim in the camps, right, were no longer capable of asserting their dignity through speech and action. And in fact, were disdained in the camps by many.
Yeah.
But we can still recognize those. And on Yom HaShoah, people recite names of people who can no longer assert their dignity. So it can be, for Arendt, I think dignity appears in the world only when it's either asserted or recognized, and especially when it's both.
Yeah.
But if dignity is not asserted or recognized, to claim that it exists somewhere inside human beings for her is just a myth.
Yeah. Can I, I'm so I'm curious to try and bring this into conversation with our present moment and thinking about um, dignity in everyday life for working class people,
Mhm.
which I think after Trump's election in 2016 has already been a conversation that a lot of people were having and thinking about the loss of respect for, the kind of hardworking American, and what it means to recognize labor and recognize those often invisible people who really make the the world that we live in,
Yeah.
who have been at the spotlight of this current pandemic because we're all now acutely aware of how much we just actually in everyday life rely upon people, going to work, a coffee shop, a restaurant, a grocery store, doctors, nurses, firemen, so on. Do you think that this moment might cause a reevaluation of dignity and work and labor in the United States? Or have you thought at all about how we recognize one another's, um, you know, action and work and labor, all of those Arendtian categories, and the way that they're being put on display in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably overly optimistic to think that a recognition of,
I'm never overly optimistic. Embrace despair.
yeah, I, I'm not sure that people will emerge, or at least I'm not confident personally that people will emerge from this recognizing the dignity and worth of human beings in the world. However, I think everybody is explicitly aware of the predicament of our common responsibility that Arendt talks about, which is that
Mm,
we are intrinsically tied to one another. And now, the nameless person that stocks the toilet paper at Kroger is vitally important, and I hope they show up to work, even though I know now that they have to use 2.5 hours of rapid transit just to get to work to do an 8-hour day, after which they have to secure their own supplies and engage in labor just to preserve themselves to get to their work
yeah,
so that I can consume these products so that I can, act in the world. I mean,
yeah,
um, to what degree am I responsible for working and acting in the world to create a common world where they have healthcare, where they have adequate pay,
yeah,
and housing? I mean, in my own city, in Dallas, um, I taught for a little bit in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Dallas, and there, there are no grocery stores. There are simply convenience stores with knockoff brands of candy and chips and sodas and alcohol and cigarettes. And there's a real impact on human bodies. The mortality rate is much higher there, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't get fresh kale from Whole Foods, right, in the way that we do. And I think what I would hope is that after this crisis, that we, having become aware of that predicament of common responsibility, that we then move to act in such a way that we build a common world where people's dignity has a space to show itself, where people can speak and act and not be diminished or silenced in some way. But I'm not overly confident.
You're not. Yeah, as you were talking, I was wondering, it's going back to, an Arendt question, but thinking about the relationship between shame and dignity.
Mm-hmm.
And, the original title for The Origins of Totalitarianism in its, first draft form was The Elements of Shame. And thinking about have you looked at those drafts, the manuscript proposal?
I haven't, no.
So she was thinking, I think shame was doing a lot of work in that original title, not just meaning one thing, but thinking about different vectors of shame. But, when you're talking about, I like, it's funny, you're talking about Kroger and, bodega shops. And my father was a dairy manager at the Kroger in Michigan, where I grew up. The first picture I actually have of myself is on a strike line with him when I'm about 6 months old. And I have many memories of like putting together food boxes for workers who were striking, over the years as they would renegotiate contracts. But then my mother bought a bodega shop like you're talking about. And I spent my formative years in high school working in one of those, and in our community, which was not a wealthy community at all. And I'm, thinking about the relationship between invisibility, shame, and appearance, and how we can engage in world building collectively in moments like this, but then, really wondering whether or not it's possible to, have a kind of shift in collective ethos that makes us more attuned to the ways in which other people are constantly being rendered invisible and silent, and are, who experience this kind of shame of invisibility because of poverty or other circumstances. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that shame is public, right? We have shame because there's someone else who views us that we're exposed to in some way. I don't think we can get rid of shame. It's interesting in Homer's The Iliad, some of the officers would say to the men, don't let your shame move you, don't let go of it, because then you will do something dishonorable, so your shame was a kind of motivator to keep them moving into battle and not retreating. They didn't want dishonor of not doing what they were required to do. So shame can be talked about in a lot of ways, right? We should have a shame about the number of homeless people in our country. In some ways, what Bernie Sanders has been talking about in many of his stump speeches, especially when he ties it back to FDR, is the kind of shame that we should feel when we look the prosperity of our country, but we see many people not able to operationalize that prosperity in their own lives. On the other hand, there should be some shame in our collective mind about the way we have not allowed women to talk about violence that has been done to them over the years and how they've been silenced, and how we've turned it into a moment in some way, I think, which turned it into a kind of commodity to be trafficked in. And I don't know that we're still hearing and seeing women in the way that we should.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot of shame there. I think Arendt's no utopian. You know, she doesn't think we're going to arrive at this kind of political environment where everybody is, you know, on equal ground, speaking and acting together. But I think she's up for the fight to make it happen. You know, in other words, she's up for the agon of political life that says,
yeah,
I'm not thinking we're going to get to utopia in the next 6 months, but you know, let's speak up and make space, create real spaces where people can do this. And
yeah,
just to plug Bard and the Arendt here, I mean, I feel like
yeah,
every time I've come to Bard, and it is a place that allows for the expression, both in speech and action, of views that many might even find offensive or repugnant, in an effort to create a space where people can show their dignity. I thought this happened at the last conference, even, you know, with all of the kind of disgruntled speakers, and there was still this exchange that I won't see anywhere else. And I think those kinds of spaces are important. I think that's something Arendt would recommend that we try to create in the world. That, and so instead of changing a kind of ethos, I think she would say, what we need to do, and this goes back to the notion of conditionality, given we are conditioned by the world that we live in, and then in turn are conditioning the world that we live in, if we want to change how we see each other, we're going to have to change the world we live in. And that's going to mean changing those public spaces. That's going to mean opening up institutions, like what the Arendt Center is doing, and making it possible for people to hear and see each other anew.
Yeah. I think, you know, I think about it in those terms. I think of it as creating space, and space for appearance, and a space for exchange and conversation. I also, you know, I think about the human condition, and the idea that everyone has a right to appear. So I also read that as, you know, we have a responsibility to one another to create spaces for appearance for people who have space for appearance, who are excluded from the public realm, and thinking about how we can form alternate, you know, public spaces where voices that aren't being heard can be heard. And I guess I do think of that as a kind of ethical responsibility that we have to one another. You know, if courage is the political virtue that allows us to step forward and make ourselves vulnerable in speech and action, you know, I think we have to recognize that not everybody has the same amount of courage, and that we have a kind of responsibility personally in that sense, to others to, you know, I don't think it's not an argument for coddling or making the world, you know, you know, that space. But I think oftentimes institutional spaces and other spaces are not as welcoming or inclusive as they could be to foster an environment for nourishing disagreement, where we can have, there are different kinds of disagreement, and to create a space where we can really think with one another in a way that's uplifting, feels in it feels difficult. It feels difficult to carve out those spaces. I think certainly we try to do that at the Arendt Center, and other places, but
maybe this comes back to Arendt's notion of thinking too. She draws on that image from Socrates of the silent dialogue between me and myself.
yes.
And in that dialogue, she says, even when she's talking about ethical decisions, what does she say in The Life of the Mind? I think that you have to ask yourself whether or not you want to come home to yourself in the evening.
Yes, Richard, she's citing Shakespeare there. And,
yeah.
And Richard III. Am I a murderer? Not I. And
Right.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then in some ways there's a kind of struggle that I have to have with myself, right? There's a difficult conversation that I have with myself in which I'm saying, well, I have a desire to do this, but I recognize my responsibilities are in conflict with that. Wrestling that out is in some ways a practice for doing that with others, right? And so maybe in that way, thinking is a preparation for our ethical engagement with others. That
Absolutely, yes.
recognizing that someone else is, not that I have the answer for them, but it's precisely in the dialogue with them that perhaps I learn something new, and perhaps they do, and come away in a much better place. I felt that way after this last conference, where I had two very different notions of addressing racism. On the one hand, Thomas Chatterton-Williams, let's be anti-race, and Ibram Kendi's, let's be anti-racist, and how in conflict those were, but yet they're both making significant and substantive contributions to what our responsibilities to others are, right? And I didn't come away with a way to solve that conflict, but I did come away with a lot more to think about, and not think that it's so easily resolved.
Yeah. Well, I think, that's very in the spirit of Hannah Arendt's conception of thinking, and that it's not about solving the conflict. It's about always expanding our way of thinking, and thinking without an end, and continuously engaging in that process of thinking in the Socratic spirit as well. I have a different kind of question related to this, thinking about dignity and how we appear before one another, we engage with one another, and this, as you just said, then we might change our minds, we might have new thoughts, we might find ourselves in disagreement with ourselves, but all of this is conditioned upon the idea of plurality and appearance in the world. So how does this confinement to our homes and this virtual appearance change? Do you see them operating in a somewhat similar way? Has this digital medium technology fundamentally changed the politics of recognition and how we virtually appear before one another? Is it possible to have dignity in these kinds of virtual spaces and be fully human?
Yeah, well, I'll address the last part first. Certainly, dignity can appear in the world without recognition. People can assert their dignity, and people are doing that virtually, for sure, in their speeches and actions. And I would say even in their absences. Part of asserting your dignity, remember, Arendt thinks we can forfeit our dignity through acting in ways as Eichmann did, right?
Right.
To give the example of those French soldiers who said, you know, we're not going to accept these honors because if we did, we'd have to forfeit our dignity.
Right.
And so there's a way in which withdrawing and being absent and even being silent is an assertion of dignity at times, and in other ways is also a recognition of people's dignity. So recognizing people's dignity means that if I think that I may potentially harm them by my presence, then withdrawing from their presence is in fact part of my responsibility, and it's a recognition and a respect for their dignity. So
Right.
we can do that. In terms of our speech and action and whether or not it can be virtual, certainly we can do it. We're doing it right here, right? We're enacting in sort of recognition and expression of dignity here. So,
Yeah.
but I think, though, at least something I'm learning in having to move all of my classes online
Yeah.
and engaging with my students, I found myself at first, I wanted it's a teaching completely asynchronous course so as not to put too many pressures on my students who may have children at home that are using the computer and bandwidth and may not have the finances for digital devices and all of that. So I try to make it as low impact as possible. But then I'm realizing that students want to be back in the classroom face to face, and I want to see them in some way and hear from them. So I'm not sure that we would ever want a virtual world. Not that that's what you were proposing, but
no, not at all. I'm just wondering how our new virtual reality changes Arendt's conceptual distinctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still able to appear, although we're also more capable of curating our appearance. Right. And that's problematic.
Right. Zoom backgrounds are a big thing now.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so you don't see my cluttered space. It's very neat behind me, as you can see, but outside are toys and Batman masks and.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Well, I mean, but that appearance is so important, and I've been thinking a lot about the concluding lines of On Revolution, which has been sitting on my nightstand for the past week, where she's talking about René Char, the French resistance fighter, who she, quotes at the end there, and then in between past and future, and in Thinking in the Life of the Mind. And she's, talking about solidarity and the lost treasure of revolution. So this moment right now feels like a moment for solidarity, to express solidarity to those we care about in our interpersonal lives, but also solidarity in the sense that for the first time in our collective lives, we're all experiencing the same global event. And, so Char is talking about the feeling of solidarity and fighting for the resistance in France, and he's talking about the gift of that, which was the ability to go naked, to appear before one another without artifice or effect, to act freely in the world. And this is not that. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been experiencing certain waves of freedom at no longer being required to appear in the world, and to, all of these events that are canceled, and, I have to radically reorganize my life on my own terms in a certain way to make this functional. But at the same time, this virtual appearance is the opposite of being able to just appear without artifice. I'm looking at myself, I'm looking at you, I'm looking at a computer screen. There's no sense of physical energy exchange happening. There's also a conscious awareness that everything we do on the internet can be recorded or screen snap for posterity. So our consciousness is always being split in that sense as well, temporally. And yeah, I'm wondering.
I'm curious about whether we are ever without artifice. You know, famously, Aristotle says in the Rhetoric that all rhetoric is a kind of cosmetic. He actually uses the word, it's a cosmos that we put on language. It's a way of organizing language. And that's a kind of artifice. He says it's not natural, it's an art, you know, that we organize language in a way. Some people speak eloquently, other people speak very plainly. And there's always a kind of artifice. And then think of the way we present our bodies in the world in terms of color and texture, and the way we understand ourselves through clothing, through jewelry, tattoos, you know, like all of this is an artifice that is in many ways like a layer. I think Georg Simmel has a few essays on fashion where he talks about, you know, the way some things are closer to the body, like tattoos, and then you have jewelry and clothing and all of these things that are much further removed. But they're all in some ways this insulation from others that we're trying to show ourselves to be. On the one hand, I'm like you, right? Because I'm dressed in some category that you recognize. And on the other hand, I'm different than you because I'm wearing it in a certain way. Or all of that is artifice. And I would say that Arendt, you know, when she talks about work, the condition of work is worldliness, right? We have to build this artificial world that makes work possible, but then that is the condition for the possibility of action. And so I don't know that we can talk about the expression of speech and action apart from artifice and the durable world that must necessarily be in place.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I'm wondering if that's not an argument for the private realm, and thinking about what we might, you know, what invitation this experience right now might be to experiencing a kind of solitude or quiet, a kind of stillness that's not so worldly, but is, you know, what she calls the four walls. The home is artifice too. You know, we make the world. The poiesis, the act of making, is also. I'm actually reminded of one of her poems that she wrote after the war, where she starts by saying, you know, ich weiß, dass die Straßen gestürzt sind. I know that the streets have been destroyed, and then I know that the houses were destroyed. We thought that they were sturdier than we. You know, which is this fragility, the fragility of the artifice of the world that we navigate, that we take for granted. And, you know, there are these moments where we're reminded of how fragile the artifice of the world actually is when we're thrown back on ourselves. And I think there's a space in there to in that becoming conscious of the artifice of the world, to experience oneself in a way that is less artificed. You know, and I think those experiences that we have as human beings, where we do get to appear without artifice, are often in intimate spaces, and spaces that don't appear at all, and that are, you know, sheltered from the world.
Yeah, and I'm reminded now of that page 9 in the Human Condition, last paragraph, where Arendt talks about that we are conditioned by the world, and it exerts a conditioning force upon us. And in fact, she says life could be impossible without things. And I think she doesn't go as far as I think she could with that. Because I think she's trying to argue against Marx and at the time. But But there is something about the way in which my life is possible and made possible by an ensemble of things. This computer, all of the internet, and the electrical circuitry that exists in this machine and outside of this house that makes this connection between us possible. What would life be like if all of that dropped away? In some ways, we're seeing a kind of premonition of what it would be like, right? As things begin to shut down and fall away, we realize how important things are to us and how reliant we are upon the world. And this is where I think when she talks about loving the world, in ways, what's really unexplored in that is the way in which those broken streets and things like the Reichstag fire that made her political, right? Not just an action of men, but the loss of this structure, right? The art and poetry and novels and streets and all of it is grocery stores and toilet paper. I mean, we are intrinsically embedded and intertwined with all of these things and being made by them. Such that as soon as we begin to lose them, we feel like we've lost some part of ourselves, right? And so maybe that's where you're saying that we somehow discover ourselves precisely when the assemblage of things breaks and we find ourselves grappling to hold on to something, we realize ourselves.
The things and even language as you were talking about earlier is a thing that carries meaning in the sense mediate our everyday life in a way that we're often not consciously aware of, and in moments like this we see and hear a bit differently, and I think we have an opportunity to think about those things and our relationships to those things and how they are shaping us and our relationships to one another in the world around us. I want to ask you, I think there's so much there. I'm curious to know if you're holding on to anything right now.
And holding on to anything?
Yes, in your thinking, are there any texts or thinkers or pieces of music or things that you find yourself reaching for or have been reminded of in this moment?
So I'm reading Proust, Swan's Way right now. I'm finally started that. In some way, I had started it some time ago, never finished, like most people. And then I saw on Twitter, Thomas Cheddar Williams said, I need to get back to Proust. And I was like, oh, perfect. Good. And I rushed out before the shelter in place.
And you bought Proust. That was your, I love that.
And so every morning I get up 4:30, 5 a.m. before the house gets up, and I sit in this space where we have like a chaise and a lamp and drink coffee and read my 25 pages of Proust. And what we found is that we have to provide some kind of order. So we have a schedule for my son, and physical activities and that kind of thing to keep him moving through the day. But we also have to have that. I go out and ride my bike, and my wife runs, and have moments for reading and moments for teaching and all of that. But we have to organize our day in that way because this is a timeless space. But I'm reading Proust. I also just finished Alfonso Lingus's The Imperative, which I recommended to you.
What is it called?
The Imperative.
The Imperative. Oh, yes, you did. You recommended that to me. I ordered it.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to get it till April.
Oh, it's a wonderful, wonderful book about the summons of things and how it summons our senses to engage with them. It's a kind of phenomenology of sensation. It's wonderful, really wonderful book. And then I'm reading Andrew Kutrafellow's Continental Philosophy, A Contemporary Introduction, which is this inventive reading of both analytic and continental philosophy from how they responded to Kant. And he does it from a Shakespearean perspective. So he calls it the War of the Roses. And you've got the House Continental and the House Analytic. It's a wonderful book. So yeah, it's a very close reading of Kant. And he mentions and actually cites Arendt's The Life of the Mind and some of her engagement with Kant in it too. So it's nice to have some of that. But in terms of Arendtian texts, I have labor, work, and action, which I'm teaching this semester. So I'm still going back into that, and have been going back to Introduction into Politics, that long kind of hobbled together essay. It feels unwieldy at times, but there's so many great insights in there. Her understanding of her current moment in the 50s when she's writing it and teaching it is that we are in a desert, and thinking of the political landscape as a desert, not a completely apocalyptic space where nothing can grow anymore, but she thinks things will grow when we begin to create those spaces where we can come together again and create things, which is very Tocquevillian. Right, that America was sort of built in these small little communities of people getting together and speaking and acting together and saying, we want our street repaved, or we want gun laws to change, or, we want a fair wage in our city, things like that, perhaps this moment will inspire us to realize our collective responsibility to one another, and then find those institutions and groups in our communities when we get to come together, because I think everybody is I know my wife and I are just like, when can we see our friends again? And my son too, we want to have that engagement in the world again with people. I think hopefully when we do, we can come back and say, wow, we learned so much from this time, and now we can work together to make a better world.
Yeah. I wanted to, you reminded me of a quote from The Human Condition. It's just one sentence.
Sure.
In the Proust and the space. The French have become masters in the art of being happy among small things, within the spaces of their own four walls, between chest and bed, table and chair, dog and cat, and flower pot, extending to these things a care and tenderness which, in a world where rapid industrialization constantly kills off the things of yesterday to produce today's objects, may even appear to be the world's last purely humane corner.
Wow. There's that summon of things there.
Yes.
They're responding to it. Yeah, that's interesting. See, I think that's so latent in her work. She really develops it, but then I think of Heinrich Blucher's engagement with the abstract expressionists.
Mm-hmm. The work he did with them in New York when they first arrived in those early years.
Yeah, and the influence of them. But then, then when I think about, because I wrote part of my dissertation on that desk of hers that's at the Arendt Center, and I remember thinking, like, I would have walked right past it into something more ornate. Looking for something more ornate, I would have passed it up.
It's this horrible mid-century modern Formica thing.
Mm-hmm. And I just wonder about her apartment down Riverside, what it was furnished with, and whether or not, I've seen some of the pictures, from inside that apartment, but I wonder how much she emulated that French kind of ideal in her home, because she invited so many friends there and she spent so much time there.
Yes.
And she spent time in France too, right? And to read Proust is to, oh my God, are summoning you, and oriental wallpaper that he describes in Odette's house, and wine and just phrases from music. And in some ways, Proust gives you this aesthetic education and awakens all of your senses, so that after you put it down, you sort of go back into the world, sort of alive to all of the things that are happening. It's excellent.
And I think that, from talking with people who knew Arendt, I have the sense that that's how she lived. I was having this conversation with Richard Bernstein at the New School a few weeks ago, and we were talking about the biography that I'm writing, and he, was talking about how Arendt has this kind of, there's this public perception that she was cold, and she wasn't into sentimentality or pity, and so people tend to presume that she was that way. And he was like, the most important thing is, she was so passionate. She was so constantly overtaken by wonder and driven by that sense of wonder and curiosity and that deep longing to understand the world and to embracing experience, I think, in a kind of pure way. When she's writing to Heinrich Blücher, is it Blücher, or is it, when she's writing to her second husband, Heinrich Blücher, on her last visit to see Karl Jaspers before he died, her great mentor. I don't know if you recall this, but she's recounting their exchange, and she says, he said, "I loved life." And I said to him, "You still love life?" And he said, "Yes, I still love life." And she affirms, "I love life." And there's this real sense of, that hunger, that desire, that pleasure that one receives, that appreciation of beauty and the small things. When she returned to France for the first time after the war, she was really struck by how beautiful the countryside was. She wrote this poem, the green on green on green, thinking about the sheer beauty of it. And
I can affirm that too. A couple of years ago, my wife and I were in 5 days in Paris and 5 days in Provence, and Provence was overwhelming. Lavender fields.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, the hills and lush with greenery. It's amazing, amazing.
It makes me really want to. I love to travel, and I travel quite a bit on my own. And I feel very pinned down in this moment, and I'm planning all sorts of trips for when I can emerge in the world again. Is there any? I'll ask you one last question, because we've gone way past the half-hour mark. But this has been really wonderful. Is there anything you're planning for when this is all over? Is there anything that you really are looking forward to doing in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really looking forward to being back in the classroom. I think one thing that has taught me about online teaching is that all of the fears about the massive online courses that we're going to wipe away classroom teaching are completely unfounded, because I listening to the academic discourse across social media about online teaching, one thing we're learning is the students want face-to-face interaction.
Yes.
I realize that what gets lost online is that when I'm teaching, say, a text that's difficult, I'm also looking at the faces and body language of my students, and I may change the lecture as I realize that some students aren't getting it. But now, I won't know if they didn't get it till after it's been recorded, and then somebody sends me an email and says, "This was a little unclear, could you clarify this?" So I think we've learned something about the need for bodily engagement with one another in the world. And so my wife and I meet with friends and their children all the time. We have people in our home and we have people's homes. And I think we're really looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to being back with my colleagues and students in the classroom.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, What am I looking forward to? I don't think I've actually thought about it. I'm really looking forward to visiting a friend of mine who lives in Vienna. I had been planning a trip there to see her, which will be quite nice. And we are making some plans. I'm also, you know, I'm looking forward to being able to move freely, just to have that sense of being able to move freely back. I think that's just where I am in my own thinking right now. In terms of immediacy, everything else feels like, constantly managing this space virtually and trying to limit my screen time each day.
Yeah, yeah.
So thank you so much for taking the time
It's such a pleasure.
to
Thanks.
talk, John, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you next October, if not before, assuming the world has resumed. And I hope that you stay sane and healthy and safe.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.